Hey everyone, I'm Boom.
And I'm Spice. This is an incredibly special episode of our main series of the podcast. So we're discussing Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. This is the first, essentially nonfiction um, book that we've ever read on the podcast. And it's also the first one that's less than or in the ballpark of 100 pages. It's easily the shortest we've ever um, read for this series, but it's also one of the most interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree. This is like you said, it's almost. I mean, it's like long essay length. In the way that it's written,
Absolutely.
and the way that it's read. So yeah, I guess we normally start off with our thoughts here, spoiler free.
Yeah, the concept of spoiler free in this one is a little
Because it's not. There's not so much. Yeah.
um,
Interesting little piece here we have.
absolutely. First and foremost, would you spark notes this?
This one is interesting for me to answer. Because I feel like we have a theme here where with most of these, and this is also in that boat where you can probably just spark notes it and you get a pretty good deal of what you're supposed to get from this book. So I imagine if I was in a class, I would. But being 100 pages, it's really not a huge time commitment to just read the thing.
Not only that, there's certain ways she writes. I've got quotes here because I wrote an essay. This is the reason, beyond it being essay length, that I found it so interesting was that I wrote an essay about this for my Intro to Literature class last year, around this time of the year, about A Room of One's Own and its relevance in today's culture. And I'll be working from that a bit in terms of thoughts I had then, the thoughts I have now that I've read it in its entirety, because this is also special because this is the first one that you could find legally online in its entirety, I believe. Like, you maybe To Kill a Mockingbird, because I'm not sure if it's in public domain anymore. Like, they released that sequel to it not too long ago. So it might be in public domain. However, this is one that you could definitely find. So, what was I going on about? Oh yeah, the Spark Notes versus reading it. It's worth reading. However, it's not necessary. But if you want the style of the piece, which Virginia Woolf is terrific at, it's well written.
Absolutely.
She's absolutely articulate.
Articulate. There's a lot of she puts a lot of humor in the book in her own way. Did not pull a quote from it, but there's just going through the book. There's a couple times where I'm like, that's a witty, like just the way that she writes and comments on things is funny sometimes.
Yeah.
And I mean, you completely miss that with the spark notes of the book.
In hindsight, a lot of women authors feel they almost infantilized in hindsight, whether it be your Bronte sisters or if you're looking at Virginia Woolf herself, it's almost seen as, because of the necessary affluence you had to have to write as a woman back then and be successful, which is covered in this very book. Like, oh, cute, you have a little hobby. She proves that she was an absolutely articulate, sharp,
Oh,
witty, funny, intense author. She's fantastic.
Absolutely.
And if, of all these books that we've covered so far, if for some inexplicable reason you've been listening to this podcast and you haven't read any of them, and by chance you have these preconceived notions about women authors that aren't contemporary, give her a read. She is absolutely dead on in a lot of her observations, especially if you're the sort of person who sees representation as an attack upon yourself due to being in some sort of privileged class. She great. She creates a great case for representation in media and the necessity of creating spaces for women within our culture. While that's not as prevalent today in terms of writing, because they've been well established at this point in general, especially when it comes to women of color, that's absolutely still pertinent today. I think that segues perfectly into our plug for next week. Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings is the next book we'll cover in this series. I haven't read it, and I don't know much about it, but its reputation is absolutely sterling. So I hope you join us for that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be an interesting. That's going to be an interesting episode because I, likewise, have not read it. And is that going to be the first time that we've both come into it not like familiar with the book?
Yeah, because we both knew about Frankenstein to some degree.
Yeah, or at least
I hadn't read it,
you know.
but
We
knew about
media,
it.
We've
Absolutely
seen it.
And then the second episode was To Kill a Mockingbird, and unfortunately we both read that. And then Rebecca, I had read it, and you hadn't.
Yeah.
So we're both coming into it blind.
Just pretty blind, yeah.
All right, fantastic. Any closing thoughts about how much you liked it or didn't?
Nothing too much here that I don't want to get into later. But no, I like it a lot. It was kind of like Rebecca to me in that, like, as soon as it took me a minute to place myself in the reading and her style, just like it did with Daphne du Maurier, like just getting acclimated. But I guess that's a lot of cases there.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, reading it through, you can really get to appreciate the kind of writer that Virginia Woolf is.
I think that speaks to the pop appeal of Harper Lee's writing. Because while we have been well noted as not the biggest fans of Miss Lee, her folksy, down-home, digestible writing style is so inoffensive that it goes down like water.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, that's a very good point to make. It's a good observation.
That sort of plays to the easiness of her symbols. She it's like playing t-ball reading that book. It really
exactly. And then you get into books, like that we're ending up liking a lot.
That are
a little bit tougher to chew.
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to talk about The Curse of R and Rebecca, or perhaps is there a major symbol in Frankenstein we could go off of? The blind man. The blind man.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like he is a good representation in terms of Frankenstein's monster's expectations of the world, and his family acting as a good representation of the world as it really is. And the fact that I had to think for a moment there to figure out a theme
exactly says a little bit.
Yeah,
a little bit about that work compared to Kill a Mockingbird,
which is To Kill a Mockingbird's strengths in some sense. I just think
Yeah.
maybe our problem is we're doing this as an exercise in exploring literature for high school and college age students, and maybe that's like people are
it's a different
pitching
level.
Yeah, people are pitching slow pitch to major leaguers when it comes to assigning To Kill a Mockingbird to high schoolers, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Whereas if it's like a middle school
Or elementary
late
school
elementary
later,
school, that might be a little bit more their speed
Absolutely.
to
And
be able
then
to pick up those symbols that are, I mean,
why do you think they might teach,
big.
or they might not teach that to younger students?
teach
To Kill a Mockingbird.
Kill a Mockingbird to younger
Why do you think they
students.
wait? You think there's a reason behind it?
I don't know. I guess maybe I guess it could come off as
It's like faux controversial.
yeah.
almost,
I
right?
guess it could come off as too much for too little people.
which is a shame
But
because
that shouldn't be the case.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
as
the-
I'm saying it, I'm
if
catching
anyone's going to
myself.
grow from it, it's them too.
Yeah, I guess that's why I was
Yeah.
having trouble saying it like that. That shouldn't be it.
That's,
But I guess that would be why.
and that says something to the low bar of the controversialness of how people can view race relations and racists in positions of power. So I mean, do you remember when Kanye West, in the middle of Hurricane Katrina, it was like a charity show, and he said that George Bush doesn't care about black people?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that rocked the world. And it's the sort of thing that he gets shamed for now by being inarticulate and saying things that are out of pocket. But back then, he got a lot of plaudits for it. And I feel like that's the sort of thing that we ought to be able to say and people be able to either refute it or accept it. Where you go, this person doesn't care about the poor or Hispanics, and have people refuted through actions. And To Kill a Mockingbird, for as vanilla, as milquetoast as it is, legitimately makes a case for racists being in positions of power. Back then, but I feel like it could act as a bit of an allegory for it today in certain ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Yeah, well, that's a
Man,
good point.
thank you, Virginia. I can't believe it. So, if you do not want this spoiled for you, which, I mean, you're not missing a whole lot. It's an essay.
Yeah, I guess this is one of them, like, where we might hang on to a couple people here for the spoiler section.
Exactly. Yeah. If you decide to, head out, please check out Maya Angelou's I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings.
Mhm.
And thank you so much for listening so far. And I hope you come back to it when you're done with Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And,
All right.
Yeah.
The coast is clear.
Yeah, are they gone? I think they're all gone. So there's this line I have highlighted within my essay where I'm talking about the literal and figurative application of a room of one's own as an idea. She wrote within her essay, and I quote Virginia Woolf, "A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And that, as you will see, leaves the great problem of the true nature of woman and the true nature of fiction unresolved." And I discuss that, end quote. I talk about how this is meant to allude to a woman having to be independently wealthy to publish works on her own. And it also discusses how their spaces, both within the household and within the industry, are dominated by men. And I feel as though some of those themes still carry over to today, where despite representation being better than it ever was before, it's still not quite where it needs to be. The fact that when Old Navy has people of color dancing in their commercials, people go, "Why are they black?" Or people of color as heroes within Star Wars films, and they go, "Why are they black?" It's a similar deal. And are you familiar with the idea of intersectionality within progressive politics?
Maybe. I mean, fill me in just a little bit to jog me here.
So, in the genesis of feminism, there were issues where there's a reason that white women were able to vote before women of color. There was a separate, there was a separation between the issues of class, race, and gender. And intersectionality is taking those and the issues of the LGBT and things like that, immigrants and everyone else that's downtrodden, and you create, a giant Venn diagram, and intersectionality lies in the middle. I think A Room of One's Own, while it may not be that piece, it can be used within discussions of that nature. It shows the limitations of her time, that she does not rope in women of color specifically, but I feel like those are blanks that we can cover up in our discussions. Not just ours, but discussions at large of the
Today.
piece.
Okay.
It's reminiscent of how the original Star Wars just didn't have black people in it. Like, obviously James Earl Jones did the voice of Darth Vader, but the dude inside the mask was white.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, it was all just white people running around space. And it says something about the time period that, you know, you've got these crazy looking aliens and these absolutely boundless ideas, and they're all white people. And it's since been rectified through recent movies. And that's sort of what we need to do with A Room of One's Own. We need to give it a bit of a fresh coat of paint. So I don't think it's Virginia Woolf's fault that she was not that ahead of the curve, even though she was ahead of the curve.
Yeah, absolutely. For where she was at and during her time, it was absolutely progressive thinking and ahead. But as it gets to now, reading it as if it were today, it might not be so. But like you said, that's a limiting factor of when she was writing this.
Who do you think is more at fault? Mary Shelley, for the implication that Southern American people aren't people, or the disclusion or the lack of inclusion of people of color, not by word, but by omission, by not specifically bringing them up, by Virginia Woolf?
That's an interesting comparison, and I think in that case, I would have to say it'd be Mary Shelley, because Mary Shelley, presumably during that time and at her age, I would imagine the information and the education would be there so that she would know
Absolutely.
that, people lived there.
Then,
So for her to say that they don't, it's hard to draw a conclusion different than she's saying that they aren't, and not just completely oblivious to it. Where in Virginia Woolf's work, like you said, by omission, she's not stating. Yeah, I guess I'm getting tied up here, but yeah.
that's okay. Take your time. She's not including people of color by name,
Mm-hmm.
but
She isn't excluding them.
either by name.
Mm-hmm.
But in its time period, I'm not sure what year this actually came out. If I'm being honest. It was 1929, I believe. That's the first copyright on this. So it wasn't quite a Harper Lee situation where her contemporaries were roping in people of color in a way that it made Harper Lee seem barbaric by comparison, almost. Meanwhile, Virginia Woolf was the cutting edge. Although, that may speak to our ignorance, because I'm sure if someone were listening to this who had a better idea of the Harlem Renaissance and the writers of color from around that time period, I would not be surprised if there were more progressive thinkers than
absolutely.
Virginia Woolf that we simply have not been exposed to or are ignorant of. And I don't know if that speaks more to the culture we were raised in, or if that speaks to the limitations of who they teach in schools, or if that speaks to the sheer volume of white female authors that have reached the forefront in our culture. I'm not too sure. but it may speak to those. And I feel like at some point down the road, it would be nice to touch on if one such author is available, a black feminist author of a similar time period, to see if they're congruent in some ways and to see if our observations on Virginia are off base.
Yeah, for sure. That would be a pretty cool thing to touch on again, and I think it would flow right in with what we try to do here.
Absolutely. Is this a hard book for you to talk about, you think?
I don't know, and I guess as I'm speaking, it seems that way.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I guess maybe my knowledge of the time and surrounding this book isn't incredibly vast, so I may struggle.
I agree. I think it may speak to our limited range as readers, because I'm a white guy and you're a white guy and Sheldon's a cat, so it doesn't quite match up with all of the perspectives that are required in thinking intersectionally about these issues. We may have the axis covered in terms of the economic problems and maybe one step of the race and gender issues, but we don't cover the gamut nearly enough. And that's not an indictment on us as people or as readers. It's merely an observation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right on the money.
That's a part of why I'm so glad that we've been reading women's authors throughout this. And I've been working for women of color as well, moving forward. A part of why we're doing Maya Angelou, part of why we're discussing doing some Toni Morrison or some, who was I discussing? Octavia Butler.
Yep.
Yeah. And that way we could, at the very least, see a slice of a different perspective through this podcast. So, do you think of The Room as literal or figurative or both?
I guess I get it as both.
Yeah.
I mean, that's pretty easy. For me, when I'm reading it, something she did a couple times in the book that I've, speaking of room and the space of one's own to be writing, she would be doing something and be interrupted. Something would happen, she'd be fishing for a thought, something would happen and she would lose that thought. And I think that speaks to having this room of one's own, she talks, because it's happened several times where she doesn't have a space, or in the book, or in her book, the character doesn't have a space. Something happens and they're struggling to maintain a thought or to extrapolate any further because it gets caught up. And that's something, if you have a room of your own or a space where you can be free of these interruptions, you can develop your thoughts a little bit further.
As the cat interrupted.
Apparently Sheldon has something to say there.
I wonder if that speaks to our privilege a bit in terms of we can make this podcast and we can read these books because not only we work, and I've got school, and you're in the military, and we're not the freest guys around, but we don't work so much that we couldn't do the podcast. And we're not in a situation where we need to share our space with so many people that making the podcast is untenable. I think that speaks a bit to our limited perspective here a bit. Not to, if anyone is watching this podcast in general, or if you're in a similar situation to us, I wouldn't see that as a discouraging thing. I'd see it as yet another peak to climb.
Yeah, it's an
as
opportunity.
Absolutely, as readers. It's a way to expand yourself, because there's a reason when representation gets brought up and people are like, oh man, why does it matter? This is why it matters. That the preset idea, conception of a person in America is a middle to upper class white dude, straight. That's seen as the norm. And that is something that, as time goes on, will be reshaped. And I think we ought to be on the head of the, or towards the head of the curve on it, in terms of trying to educate ourselves through literature and listening to the voices of people of color. There's this quote from Julie Robbins Solomon of Ohio State University's English department that I quoted within my essay. She says, Woolf's use of spatial metaphor is as exhilarating here as it is defiant in a room of one's own, hereafter referred to as a room, where space, a room full of it, makes woman's social and political existence meaningful. The room serves as a potent political metaphor for women because it concretizes visually, tactilely, and tactilely, the politicization of the personal and personalization of the political. So, to rope this back around to what we were talking about, we don't have a whole lot of our issues politicized where it comes to things like contraceptives or medical care. As men, as cis men, we rarely deal with people encroaching upon our right to do just about anything with our bodies. Is that a fair take?
Yeah, that certainly is.
And that's another dimension to view the room, as Virginia Woolf puts it. It's not a literal room necessarily, it's also your body. It's an encroachment upon space that is seen as yours, but especially in her time and still today in a lot of places within America and elsewhere, one that you don't necessarily own once you're in a marriage, or even within a family.
Yeah, okay.
Or even within a country, in this case. Look at what happened in Texas in terms of, essentially shadow banning abortion.
Mm-hmm.
It's an encroachment upon the right of women and how they're able to use their bodies and how they're able to exert control over themselves and their situations. And that's another point to the relevance of a room of one's own. The fact that it's nearly 100 years old and still today
is completely relevant.
Absolutely. And if there's one thing other than what we've already given Harper Lee today that I could give her, is that To Kill a Mockingbird is still relevant in senses in terms of the racism of people in positions of power, but hers is a lot more cartoonish than A Room of One's Own, because women are still marginalized in a lot of places, in a lot of workspaces, and their interests are still treated as lesser than of men. And these issues are absolutely still pertinent. It's been illustrated lately, and I think it's going to be illustrated moving forward as well. It's hard to say what your favorite part of this is, because it's all good, but it's all information. I'm sorry for any listener at home. This is just an awkward book to talk about. It's not bad, and it's not grand. It's great, but it's not so outwardly so. It's not going to blow you away like Rebecca, but it will make you mull things over like Frankenstein. With the only difference being Frankenstein has the sorts of window dressing that could make it get spun around into the unrecognizable visage of Frankenstein that it is today.
Yeah, modern day pop culture Frankenstein.
Yeah, there's no big green guy that could run around in the representation of A Room of One's Own.
No, it's bare.
Exactly. We've discussing the movie adaptations of the works that we cover in the mainline series. And we, to my knowledge, could not do that at all for A Room of One's Own. We could potentially find a documentary, but an actual live action adaptation, no way.
I have no idea what it'd look like.
It would be bizarre. Although they could do something with the idea of Shakespeare's hypothetical sister from within that essay.
Okay.
That
would be, could be a really interesting movie.
Absolutely. And I've had this book that's sitting in my car right now. I need to read it. Where Raymond Carver's wife, his first wife, Mary Ann Burke Carver, wrote a memoir about her time married to Raymond Carver, who, during their marriage, was abusive and an alcoholic and had a very complicated relationship. And it's interesting because she spent all her time fixing Raymond's messes and putting out his fires when she wrote a memoir, which, while I haven't read it, I plan to imminently. It's good from what I've heard. She could have been a writer. And the fact that she couldn't, due to the ineptitude of Raymond Carver in certain facets of his life, the prioritization of his artistic pursuits over hers due to financial strain, it really spotlights the Shakespeare sister effect.
Yeah, exactly what she's talking about.
Yeah, she's a wasted talent.
Yep, what could have been.
And the advent of technology may open the floodgates for these things. Because look at us. We're not geniuses, and we're not terrific writers. We've written a lot, and we've talked about a lot of books. And all we needed was a $40 mic and a computer and a space, ironically, that was of our own, that was quiet enough that we could think and we could discuss, we could feel safe, and we could feel uninterrupted. And it's a luxury that Virginia Woolf had that a lot of women, a whole lot of women, would have really been grateful for. And that's something that we shouldn't take for granted. It's a privilege to be able to pursue artistic pursuits in such a way that our economic or societal issues do not step on our toes in those pursuits. And that comes back to the intersectionality of it. It's not just the fact that they're women, but they're lower class women, women of color, women who are treated differently than other women, women who financially are not given similar breaks as other women. That's a big deal in this. And while it's a blind spot of Virginia Woolf, it can't be one of ours. That's not an indictment on her as a writer. She's fantastic. It's not an indictment on her as a progressive, which, while we're going to do some research potentially, for the time being, she seems quite progressive for her time. It's merely an indictment on the time and how little white feminism cared about people of color and how we can't afford to do the same. History doesn't need to repeat itself if we look at the way our four, in this case, sisters, or four mothers looked at women of color, and we look at that with a lens of doubt and a lens of scrutiny. and go, these ideas are great. Let's add to them. Let's expand who they're about. Let's be more explicit about who they're about. Not just women of color, but also trans people of color, trans people in general, gay people, things of that nature. To sit idly by and exclude them by omission is to play into the hand of people who want to divide the marginalized people of America, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I agree completely. It makes me think. It's one of those things where at the time of its writing, like you said, super progressive, but there's no shame or problem. Well, problem. No, there's no shame. Well, there's no shame in being ignorant. There is shame in remaining ignorant. It's something like that.
I absolutely concur.
Where you only know what you know, but that's no reason to stay in the dark, especially now, where we have the resources. We're in a time where, we don't live with Virginia Woolf here. There's no reason for us to be ignorant anymore.
Absolutely. We are living in a day and age where if I could find this for free, imagine the amount of women of color that are writing this for free,
Mm-hmm.
that are providing context. There's a rapper, No Name, who she herself has grown as a progressive in recent times because of people educating her. Her handle, her rapper name was initially No Name Gypsy, and like a vagabond sort of sense, and she did not realize that was treated as a slur, and has since dropped it from her handle. And as a progressive woman of color, who seemed to be one of the most well-read women in her field, she still found a room to grow. She still found places where she was not quite enlightened, and she gained perspective in them. That is the power of a room of one's own. It fills your mind with feminist ideas that are absolutely important, but it also allows you to expand upon them in such a way that we are growing where Virginia Woolf was limited. And hopefully, whenever Boom and I die, people who view these sometime in the future can grow in places where we had blind spots
Mm-hmm.
that are of our time as well. That's a part of the problem of viewing Virginia Woolf in a vacuum and going, well, she wasn't progressive in this way. We're going to be seen as
the future.
Backwards.
It's going to
Exactly.
happen. That is the nature of time.
It's trying your best to be fair and equitous and equitable to people within your day. That's of utmost importance, so that people can look back like Virginia Woolf and say, you tried. You weren't perfect. No one's perfect, especially in hindsight, but you tried. That's this podcast. That's part of why we choose the authors that we do. And that's what I hope you do, both in your literature and in life, is reading people who are different than you, talking and listening to people who are different than you, and gaining perspective through art and through the experiences of people who have lived a different life than you. And on that note, he's been Boom. I've been Spice. Thank you for watching.
And well, actually, if
Oh,
I may,
my
just
apologies.
real quick. No,
Oh.
yeah, I know I've been silent this whole time.
Oh
but
man, I didn't.
Just no,
bonus
I get it.
track.
Yeah.
Exactly. Remix.
But
Please.
I wanted to bring up one thing.
I didn't.
Now that
mean
we
to-
talk
to
about
rip
this,
it back open.
and
Absolutely.
and speaking about how this room should be for everyone. She did include a quote here in chapter 1 that I liked a lot, and it reminded me of reading Rebecca, where there was no name given to the protagonist. And she, in chapter 1, right there at the beginning, she says, "Call me Mary Benton, Mary Seton, Mary Carmichael, or any other name you please. It is not a matter of importance." And this is that, goes back to that like ambiguous character where you can kind of put yourself in the shoes no matter who you are. Like, it's speaking of nobody in particular, just like, you know, it just as going through it, it reminded me of that Rebecca, in that depending on how you're looking at it, it can be anyone.
I agree. That's absolutely pertinent. And I think that opens the door to progressive ideas.
Yeah, and that just on the
Yeah.
just for something on the tail end of that. I don't know. I'm sure. It's obviously intentional the way she did that. Then, it's a good. If you're writing a book that you want to make everybody understand, it's a good way to bridge a gap.
And if you're on the fence about reading this, the coy nature of that line is not out of character for her. It also speaks to the playfulness of this novel, or this essay rather, that she's able to speak so flippantly about her name because she realizes in the history of women's writing, so often they've had to write under pen names that it almost doesn't matter, and that her ideas are whatever important to her. And I'm glad you raised that point. I'm sorry for...
No, that's all right.
I sewed it up and ripped it right back open.
No, after being quiet, I totally get it.
I'm sorry. Sheldon was just the noisiest I've ever heard him. That was nuts. It seems like he wants to jump onto the table. I hope he doesn't do that. Are there... Just meowing into the wall now. Thanks. Do you have any more thoughts before we go then?
I guess not for the trail that we're following here. I mean, there's a lot with all these books, I guess, that we can keep going with. But
Well,
I feel like with where we're leaving off, it might be...
Well, if there's a thread you want to pull, please. I absolutely implore you to.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. This is kind of getting off track of where we've been, but I think, and I guess it kind of goes with the whole nameless characters kind of thing. She talks a lot about being how when you write, your goal should be to make good writing. You want to be androgynous, and writing as a him or a her is, she believes it as a negative thing, and I found that a little interesting.
I wonder if that is meant for certain people and not others.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like the representation through writing, and I'm sure at some point we'll cover The Hate U Give, that one is absolutely tethered to the idea that the protagonist and the writer themselves are black. And this is a black story about characters who are African American. And I want to cover this so bad, but we're on our current kick. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. That one's also absolutely pertinent, that you understand that he was an African-born man who spoke both Igbo and English, that it's not translated out of his native tongue, and that it's absolutely an African-born and made story. And I think that speaks to the limitations of Virginia Woolf once again, that divorcing your books in your writing from your experience is not healthy for some people more than it is for others. In our cases, white men have made art forever, and it's been venerated as good art forever. And our perspectives have been validated through culture forever. And us writing as androgynous people may be useful. However, in her case, it's not the same. In Maya Angelou's case, it was not the same. In Toni Morrison's case, it was not the same. And it's pertinent to view Virginia Woolf in the context of 1929. That she was not thinking progressively, or as progressively as we are, in terms of intersectional feminism. That she thought it was a good idea that you take your stories and you take yourself out of them. I think being androgynous, both sexually and in terms of your race, at the very least, if you're a marginalized person in America, is absolutely not healthy. And we could absolutely use some more. If you want to, go right ahead. But it's a perspective that I think is valuable still. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good point, and and pretty in line with what I'm thinking, where it's a situational thing, and interpersonal thing depends on who you are.
Is there anything else you noticed that you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I guess just one more thing, and it's not so. And this one isn't so much. It doesn't deal so much with the progressive themes in the book. It's just kind of something I noticed that I don't. I mean, I hate to be like a critic guy, because I'm not. But that's not unless it's Harper Lee, apparently.
Yeah, exactly.
But she just made a couple interesting points about writing with emotion, and how to make, like, to be writing well, you should be in a state of contentment and not be clouded by emotions. You should be writing with a clear head, almost. Like she talks about a little bit, like writing with clear-minded, and that's just interesting to me. It's not that it's that I'm really against, but like a lot of the times when I've found I'm able to make good art or something like that, it's from a state of intense emotion.
Do you think it's valuable that this is an essay and not necessarily a more subjective piece of art?
True.
Yeah.
True.
That it's.
I guess that's a good point to make right there. If I were trying to write an argument in an essay and make a point, then absolutely.
Anger sort of muddies the way you.
Yeah, if you're writing from emotion, your points are going to automatically seem a little forced, less so matter of fact.
And I know you sort of divorced this from the progressive ideas for a second there, but there's a stereotype among feminists that they're angry black women, and it's something that is pervasive. It goes around a lot of culture, and I think Virginia Woolf may have been either viewing the stereotype or was potentially the bedrock for the stereotype in some ways, where it's like a cool mind, even-handedness leads to good work.
Absolutely. Yep. If you're trying to get your point across in this media with these ideas, it's better to come without. You don't want to fall into that kind of mole. I don't know.
Yeah, and then you look at Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. People have sort of declawed Martin Luther King in hindsight. However, he did certain things as a progressive leader that were not necessarily conscionable in the name of civil rights. Like, the example I use often is in the hopes of gaining sympathy for his cause, when he'd have people go out for protests where they'd inevitably be hosed and had dogs sicked on them. They'd have kids out there in the hopes that they could gain sympathy among suburban white people. And that is pretty unconscionable. However, the ends justified the means, and they ended up getting their civil rights bills and everything. That is partially that seems like the difference here. There's a lack of urgency in Virginia Woolf's writing, and in some cases they simply can't relate. That we're still protesting about similar things in the years 2020, 2021. It really is telling about where race relations are versus where women are, and the fact that women are still fighting for the right to remain or to not carry out a pregnancy. That shows how being civil the way Virginia Woolf wants them to be gets you. And it's not necessarily an indictment on her because she didn't see the next 100 years of progress and how slow it's been. How absolutely dreadfully slow it's been. It's like Joe Biden supported segregation. There was a time where he supported segregation. That is huge. It's absolutely don't ask, don't tell is not more than 15 years old. It's not a far past. Harper Lee died recently. This stuff is recent. Rosa Parks died recently. It's like 15 years ago. This stuff is still fresh. And the fact that it didn't come sooner is potentially an indictment on Virginia Woolf's sort of attitude, where it's be quiet, be civil, and it will come. That's the way you ought to view these exercises. And whether this is her reasoning or not, who knows? Virginia Woolf is dead, and so will I. It's still telling that it might not be her perspective, but a lot of people view feminism that way. And that we're still fighting for the same issues today as we were 20, 30, 40, 100 years ago is very telling about how effective that attitude is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a good point. Finish us up here.
So, I'm sorry for cutting you off earlier. I'm really glad we had this conversation. I jumped the gun a bit, guys. I'm so sorry.
That's how this thing goes when we don't have a script.
Gotta play it by ear.
Yep. It's a show that we can't always find a perfect end for.
Well,
or don't know.
Exactly.
It's hard to read a mind while we're talking,
And we can't exactly sit down and discuss it in the middle of it.
Yeah.
If I could freeze time, if only. So, next week, we're going
I love it every time.
Feels good, though.
Yeah. It just makes sense.
Yeah.
And maybe eventually it will be in that. Or maybe it will. Who knows?
Yeah, who knows?
I mean, it'll almost certainly be read within a couple days, but
that's how we handle
trying to figure out a time is it in our really not all that amazingly busy schedule.
Truly. Just ships passing in the night. We're going to be covering I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. And I hope you join us for that. And I hope you read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf. I know we were critical of it, but I think it was criticism in a different vein than Harper Lee's.
Absolutely. This by no means is meant to be any real attack at all.
Well, it wasn't meant to be an attack on Harper Lee.
And it was no. It could come off. It was more. It just was more.
I engaged with the text
Yeah.
with A Room of One's Own.
Yeah.
While I wrung out To Kill a Mockingbird. Like the fact that Boo Radley was not a deeper symbol than anything other than race relations hurt so bad.
Yeah. That's what it was. It was more so disappointing.
Exactly. A Room of One's Own is shorter, and it is a bullet. It is compact. It hits you. And we combat with it because it's relevant.
Exactly. Completely relevant. And it leaves pieces that you can build upon and should.
Virginia Woolf would be happy that we did this. I don't know if Harper Lee would be happy about episode 2. That's the difference maker. We engaged with the text with this. Any thoughts, or would you like to wrap it up?
I think that we're in a good place here with it now. I think that was a good discussion.
Fantastic.
I'm glad we got to.
I'm sorry for cutting you off
go.
earlier.
Not at all. Not at all.
I won't do it again. I promise. Please join us next week for I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. I've been Spice.
And I'm Boom, and we will catch you next time.